Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Accounts Payable Policies and Procedures for a Remote Workforce, presented by CFO Daily News and sponsored by Tipulti. And now, a word from our sponsor.
Thank you, Ty. We're glad to be part of this discussion. A little bit more about myself and what Tipulti does, and then we'll get on with today's presentation. I've been at Tipulti for over 5 years, and tell you the truth, I'm not a finance person, but I've been on the marketing side of technology companies for longer than I haven't. And it's always the same story. It's some manual process that needs solving, or they need to take the business to the next level. It's true for marketing departments, sales teams, IT, engineering, everyone within the organization. But what's unique about our era is that finance is finally getting a little technology love, especially today when we're all working from home. The paperless back office is no longer a wish, it's a necessity. So technologies that can modernize finance operations and go beyond solving one or two AP pain points and address the entire holistic payables process, that's what strategic finance teams are really trying to achieve. We work with over 1,000 companies, and many are likely brands you recognize. And proudly, those customers stick with us at a very high retention rate. And that indicates that we're important to them at an infrastructure level, like an ERP or their spreadsheets. We relieve them of the AP burden so they don't need to deal with them and can focus on more strategic parts of business. CFOs and controllers have exchanged their bank fobs for software that lets them pay thousands of suppliers worldwide in a matter of clicks, securely, accurately, and in an auditable way. Here's what else I can tell you about Tipulti customers. They bring us in when there's an immediate need and when they also want to look down the road 6 months, 12 months, 2 years into the future, when they see their business building momentum. They might be expanding internationally, increasing the pace of their business, or needing greater financial controls to protect against payables risks. And is there any finance leader out there who's not looking to optimize their headcount? Finance has had to set an example for the entire organization around efficiency and accuracy. So do they choose to spend headcount on someone at an analyst level, someone who can likely contribute long-term, or do they use their headcount to hire an AP clerk whose job it is to key invoices and get approvals and make payment runs? Tipulti solves today's payables challenges and readies you for tomorrow. The 80% of workload we save companies, the integrated best practices around tax, regulatory, and fraud detection compliance, and the faster financial close we enable are about anchoring your success. So, without further ado, I'll hand it back to Ty. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the chat box in the control panel. If they're regarding the subject being presented, I'll add them to the queue for questions at the end. Now I'd like to introduce your speaker, Pamela Fagan-Schull.
Thank you so much, Ty. Just a couple of quick little things that I want to remind you of as far as everything goes. When you do think of your questions as we go through today's class, I will ask that you please refer to the slide that you were asking about if it does refer to one, and that way I can look back and be able to answer your questions and everything else, and make sure you let us know what it is that you need to know about certain things. In the meantime, one of the key things that I do want to point out to you is, please remember, this webinar is presented from an auditor's point of view. I am a compliance auditor. I work very closely with IRS and state tax auditors and things like that. So it's recommended that for any tax or compliance issues that we talk about in putting together your policy and procedures manual, please consult with your tax consultants and of course any kind of attorney consultants that you might need to in writing your policies and procedures that are specific to your organization. Now, I also want to remind you that when you're writing a accounts payable policy and procedures manual, on one hand, even though many of us have gone electronic, like our sponsor today is talking about, you still have to remember we've got internal controls to think about. And so sometimes thinking about how it would have laid out should it had been done within an office rather than remotely, or even without, maybe with paper instead of electronic, has a lot to do with trying to put everything together. So what we're going to do today is we're going to take a look at basically what some of the major issues with all of this is, okay? With so many government audits looming on the horizon, then there's a necessity on our part to use internal controls to protect the company's assets and the bottom line as much as possible in effective accounts payable policies and procedures. And if you want to be efficient, then you've got to make sure that you have everything in place. If you were to asked to write a job description, as the slide here is talking about, if you had to write a job description for an accounts payable department person, the leader or even the clerks or whatever, then what would need to be in that job description? Well, the best answer is, what does accounts payable do? They protect the company's assets, they protect the bottom line, and one of our key things is to prevent fraud. And unfortunately, with us working remotely, the most impacted one in all of this is probably the preventing fraud area. So today we're going to reveal tips and techniques and strategies that are going to enable you to write effective and efficient policies and procedures to not only satisfy your company, but to satisfy IRS and your qualified accountable plans for reimbursements. Make sure you're following all your rules and regulations for sales and use tax issues. And of course, making sure that your company is doing everything in a timely fashion, but definitely to prevent and to detect fraud. So you're going to learn proven approaches that cut the time, frustration, and all of that in processing payments, invoices, and so on. Plus, the other thing about it is with non-essential personnel going remote, we need to understand how to protect our company electronically as far as security goes. And so we've got to make sure we can discuss how electronic methods will enhance our accounts payable process and make it a lot easier. I will be recommending to you a couple of resources also that will help you in this area and can be used basically with your electronic system that you have in place, okay? So our agenda today, here's what we're going to be looking at. First off, what we want to talk about is the importance of having an accounts payable policy and procedures manual for your organization. Whether you're remote or not, the issue is that there are certain things, believe it or not, by law, especially tax law, where we're required to have certain things in writing. And that's one of the things we're going to be talking about today. We're also going to talk about how to write an effective policy and procedure manual that people will follow, which gets us to the third section, communicating to our personnel and vendors how to follow those policies and make sure that they do so. So let's take a look first at the importance of an accounts payable policy and procedures manual. Now, I don't need to say this to you, but I'm sure that many of you have heard the same thing I have. Oh, we don't need to have a policy and procedures manual. It's too much trouble. And well, no one follows it anyway. How many times have you heard that? And I've also heard people say, don't put it in writing. It can be used against us. Well, first off, let me tell you something. If you get audited by external auditors, by IRS, by sales and use tax auditors, one of the key things they're going to ask you is, what is your policy? What is your procedure? And of course, external auditors are always looking for the internal control factors. And if you're a nonprofit and receive any kind of grants or anything, that's going to be extremely important. So reasons to have an accounts payable manual are listed here for you. Number one, IRS compliance. There is an area in the IRS code where it basically states that we must have a written policy, or what happens is it creates a taxable event. And so we've got to be careful there. And then, of course, like I said, when it comes to your external auditors, they're looking for those internal controls to detect and prevent fraud as much as possible. And with us being remote, there is that possibility of outside fraud coming in, someone hacking into your system and that sort of thing. So we've got to make sure it's secure and all of that. Then, if any of you have ever had to go through a state sales and use tax compliance audit, you know as well as I do that your procedures are extremely important there. All tax problems start at point of sale, point of purchase. There's outside people at your company who have to be involved, purchasers, people that place orders, people that receive any kind of goods or services, that sort of thing. And of course, a main reason, believe it or not, is to save time and money. As you go more electronic with your accounts payable, we cut out a lot of steps, so it saves a lot of time and money for the company. But we also need to work with our vendors to make sure that they get paid not only in a timely fashion, but that they understand what our system is really all about. And then, of course, one of the other things we want to do is to reduce and eliminate duplicate payments and errors as much as possible. These are areas where companies really lose a lot of money if they're not careful. So we want to make sure that we take care of those things too. All right. So basically, these are the kinds of things that we'd be looking for as far as an accounts payable department goes. So where and how do we begin to do all of this? Well, all right. When you're trying to create your comprehensive policy that's easy to follow and will guarantee results, there are 3 basic steps, which we will be going through. Okay, step 1, determining what really needs to be included in the manual itself. And one thing you're going to find out is no matter what, if you change even one little part of your procedure or policy, you'll have to update this manual on a regular basis. Example, I wrote an accounts payable policy and procedures manual for a company that I work with. And as soon as the pandemic hit, we had to all of a sudden come up with a disaster recovery plan that was totally outside the realm of any plans we had had in the past, because all of a sudden everything went remote. And so it really changed how we had to do some of the procedures. So determine what needs to be in that. And then step 2, flowchart out your current process so you can eliminate any kind of duplicate steps, save time, but also it will help you notice where you might have internal control loopholes. When there's a loophole, that's when people slip through and commit fraud. And then step 3, communicate this policy, this procedure, not just to your accounting personnel, but other personnel that have anything to do with ordering, receiving, that sort of thing, but also communicating with your vendors what your process is and what their part in it is really all about. So those are the 3 steps that we're going to be going through. Now, when you're putting your policy and procedures manual together, who needs to be included in putting all this together? Well, it's not just the accounts payable department. Okay, and what I mean by that is who's going to be impacted by the entire process? All right, we've got our accounts payable personnel, that we know. But what about people outside the accounts payable department, such as management, supervisors, and even some of your stakeholders? They might be involved in certain parts of the process. And then, of course, how many of these people are remote workers and need to be involved? And believe it or not, there are times when you may have to involve information to people like contractors, independent contractors. I mean, part of our process in accounts payable is making sure we pay contractors properly for their services. Well, they need to understand their part as far as making sure we get their 1099s and that kind of information. I meir their W-9s and all of that, so we can issue a 1099. I said it backwards for a moment there. And then you've got the vendors that have their setups. Are they able to send you their information electronically so you can pay them electronically? ACH payments, you got to work with the bank and everything else on that. Then, of course, you've got to take in consideration what would the auditors look for as far as internal controls. And then we have to think about our step-by-step processes in filing proper forms with IRS, state and local tax agencies when it comes to sales and use tax and so on. So there's a lot of people that accounts payable touches, and they all need to be part of what we do when we create this manual, all right? So what exactly do we need to be, what needs to be included in our manual? Okay, well, first off, you got to look at your current policies. Are they covering all the bases? Okay, when you analyze all the facets of what accounts payable is about, you have to determine all the functions that you touch, and it's all very important. Like, for instance, not only are we paying the checks, but we have to work with purchasing and ordering, receiving when it comes to goods. We have to work with whoever orders any kind of services, managers, supervisors, and so on. And then the other thing we got to think about is the master vendor file maintenance. How often do we purge it? That sort of thing. What information do we need from vendors in the first place so we can get it in there? There's all kinds of things you have to think about, okay? Then communicating with vendors, like for instance, what are your payment terms? What are their payment terms? What expectations do they have for how they're going to be paid, whether it's by credit card, whether it's by ACH, or I know some of you may still once in a while have a physical check you might have to send out, things like that. And so it's one of those things where we need to communicate with the vendors and find out exactly what their function is in the accounts payable area. And then, of course, tax issues and forms, the 1099s for contractors, and of course, sales and use tax. How many, of you have to file actual payments and reports to the different states, and do you have nexus with other states? So you have to know about them, make sure they get their money. And then, of course, our e-files, the record keeping. And when we talk about the record keeping, do you have a good software for not only keeping the records, but are they kept on the cloud? Do we use an intranet? Is there a special software? And how long do we hold those records? There's just a whole bunch of things that are involved in the record keeping to satisfy the various agencies and, of course, our internal auditors themselves. And then finally, of course, what are the remote workers' responsibilities in all of this? So do your current policies cover all of these bases? All right. So I think what we're going to do right now is, Ty, I'd like to go ahead and do our first polling question and see what people think up to this point. Okay, so I'll turn it over to you, Ty.
Thank you, Pamela. Please submit your responses in the chat box for the first poll. Reasons to have an AP manual: A, detect and prevent fraud; B, tax compliance; C, reduce and eliminate duplicate payments; D, A and B only; or E, all of the above. And 100% of the audience answered E, all of the above.
And they are right. See, the thing is, you'd be surprised how many people say, oh, we don't need that. Well, I just gave you multiple reasons, and these are only 3 of them that are out there. So keep in mind, when someone says, why should we put it in writing? Here's your answers as far as that goes. Okay, well, let's go ahead and let's take a look at a couple of other things. How do we actually write an effective policy and procedures manual and make it work and everything else, okay? So first off, we have to consider the 3 main controls of accounts payable. Number 1, receive only the goods and services ordered. Number 2, pay only for the goods and services received. And number 3, prevent fraud. And it's interesting because when I teach a full accounts payable class and things like that, I tell them, yes, we have the 3 controls: receive only goods and services ordered, pay only for goods and services received, and then I said commit fraud. And people look at me and they go, what do you mean commit fraud? Well, in order to prevent it, you have to know what to look for. And the bad part about it is most of us are not criminals, so we don't even think about some of the things that people would do. You would not believe some of the things that people do to commit fraud. And if there is a loophole in any one of these three main controls, that's when fraud will happen. So we want to make sure that doesn't happen. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. But how do you get people to follow your policies? Well, there's an equation that basically is out there for policies and procedures. Consistency plus comprehension equals compliance. All right. Your policy should be written so that consistently people do the same thing every single time. There's consistency. Everyone follows all the rules. But the big problem is a lot of people say, well, why should I follow those rules? Why should I follow that policy? We need them to comprehend the importance of doing things in order, by the book, and that sort of thing. And this is what will get us compliance. If your people that are outside the accounts payable department help you write some of this, this is one of the best ways to get them to not only be consistent and comprehend, but also that will equal our compliance. Okay, so what policies actually need to be addressed? Okay, well, first off, step by step ordering, receiving, and paying. Okay, there's authorizations for each step so that basically we know who can do what. And with remote, it's even a little bit harder because you might have to pass things electronically from one person to the other. But who's got what authorizations to do the ordering, the receiving, and the paying? And basically, as we go to electronic, most of us go from a three-way match to a one-way match, as they call it. Well, in the long run, the three-way is still there. It's just that it's done in one continuous movement, which is why they call it a one-way match. And then, of course, we've got to think about the record-keeping requirements that go with all of this. Sales and use tax auditors may tell you have to hold on to things for 5 years. IRS may say 7. And your internal auditors, especially if you're a nonprofit, get grants, may say 50 years, or if you're a state or local government, it may say indefinitely. So you've got to know what your record-keeping requirements are for all the different types of documentation, whether it's physical or electronic, you have out there. And then, of course, we got to worry about the internal controls. The person who's ordering should not be the person receiving, should not be the person paying. So we've got to look at that. So how do we prevent and detect fraud? And one of the biggest areas where fraud happens more than anything else, believe it or not, is in expense reimbursements. And so that's one of the areas the companies really have to pay attention to. And I believe we've had a webinar on something like that in the past, if I remember right. And then sales and use tax knowledge. A lot of people really don't understand sales and use tax and what is nexus and how do I know when I have to charge a tax or when I have to self-assess a use tax. These are some of the things that have to be addressed in our policies and procedures. And most important, the master vendor file. Who's going to maintain it? Who has access to it? And how are we going to add and subtract and purge and that sort of thing? Do we have the most recent information? How do I make sure my vendors give me the most recent information, and so on? So we need to address policies that cover every bit of these. And then, of course, creating an accountable plan for expense reimbursements as outlined by IRS, and you have to watch out for the new remote rules that go with that, which basically there's classes out there on that and everything else. So we've had one just recently on that one. So basically understanding expense reimbursements and making sure your employees understand it, what the procedures are to get reimbursed and so on, so we can keep it on a non-taxable basis as much as possible. And then, like I said, some kind of policies that talk about, in our first step, communication with vendors and suppliers, independent contractors, ACH payments, that sort of thing, okay? And most importantly, terms and conditions of payments. All of these things should be covered in the policies and procedures manual. All right, so the first thing you have to do in step 2, what we're talking about, the first thing you have to do is you've got to figure out who does what. Well, before you can do anything, you have to figure out who am I paying. All right, In accounts payable, we work with purchasing, and we deal with contractors and vendors. And if you're dealing with a contractor, you've got to figure out for IRS purposes, are they a US person or a non-US person? Am I looking at W-9s? Do I have to deal with W-8s? What about 1099s, 1042s, and so on? Okay. Now, over there on the other side of our company, we've got we've got payroll and HR. They're dealing with employees. And basically, they have to worry about things like the W-4, the W-2, and so on. Here's the question. When you're collecting your data of who to pay, you've got to look at the contractor rules. Is this person really a contractor? When I pay someone for their services, let me put it this way. If you were to ask IRS what their definition of a contractor versus an employee is, they're going to tell you they are someone who provides you with a service. Okay, now, first off, someone who provides us with a service, that does not answer our question. You've got to make sure you understand the rules of who can be a contractor. So in accounts payable, we know we're paying the right person. And if there's a red flag that says, whoa, wait a minute, this person really needs to be an employee, we need to basically have something over there. So one of the policies you would have to create is how to determine when someone is a contractor versus an employee. Okay, that's extremely important. So we've got to figure out who collects the data. Then in that step 2, we have to flow chart out our process. Now, this is a typical old style type process, but I did this on purpose because even if you're using the newest electronic systems, there's still several people involved in the steps of processing an invoice from PO to invoice, okay, to payment and everything else. I mean, you'll notice that over on the far left, I've got purchase orders with purchasing, and there's a person's name, Ted Jones. I put a name there for a reason. Ted is not supposed to also receive the goods or services. So I need someone else to do that if I possibly can. Then what happens is all of the information that for the purchase order, the receiving, the goods and services, it all gets sent over to someone in accounts payable, which in this case we said was Karen Lewis. She's doing the matching of the data and the data entry and all that, which hopefully that if you're doing electronic system, you don't have to do any data entry. So we've reduced it down, but there still needs to be someone that knows, wait a minute, yes, not only do I have an invoice, but we've actually received the goods, or we actually did receive the service, and so on. Then down below, you've got someone else who's handling the master vendor file. Okay, that's Lisa. And when it comes to processing payments, someone's got to approve the payments. Well, in this case, we got a Gary there, Gary Sims. Granted, it's a lot easier to do bank reconciliations now, but we can't have Gary or Karen do that. It's got to be someone else. So now Lisa's back there for that. If there is any check printing or checks that are released, who's going to do it? And it can't really be the same person that did the other things. And then, of course, you've got, in the old-fashioned way, we have the check signing and the mailing of the checks and so on. The key here is you'll notice that we've got multiple people involved, all right? And the bad part about that is the smaller your company, the less likelihood you can do this. What I'm looking at here in this flow chart is how to make sure I have internal controls. The person who is ordering is not the person receiving, is not the person who is paying. That's the idea, if you possibly can. This is how you prevent fraud as much as possible, okay? So you have to have a step-by-step procedure. So in testing your controls to make sure everything's okay, you're testing them for design and effectiveness. The flow chart shows the design. It's a microscopic picture of your steps or process step by step. It's a good tool for making sure your controls are in place. But then you can sample for effectiveness. You can see, is it working? This is an efficient means for testing. And this sampling is what your auditors do. If you get audited, then by external auditors or even internal auditors, they're looking for effectiveness. These spot audits will make sure that the transactions are happening properly from beginning to end. Now, I'm going to go back on my flow chart for just a moment. This will also show you where to put authorizations. Who can do what? Who's got access to what portions of your system? for electronic processing, okay? Now, what do you want to look for? In creating your step-by-step process, what you're trying to look for is, are my internal controls in place? And the definition of internal controls is it's a process affected by an entity's board of directors, management, or other personnel designed to provide reasonable assurance regarding the achievement of objectives in the following categories: effectiveness and efficiency of operations, reliability of financial reporting, and compliance with applicable laws and regulations. This is what your auditors are looking for. So if your step-by-step process follows all of this, you will know that your internal controls are in place, okay? What internal controls do is they help an entity achieve its performance and profitability targets and try to prevent loss of any sort. It ensures that you've got reliable financial reporting, that when I see my financial statement for profit and loss and everything else, that I know it's as accurate as possible. Therefore, if I was a stakeholder, being able to make good financial decisions. And of course, it's going to show that we are in compliance. So if I get audited by IRS or state and local tax, sales tax auditors, I can say, yes, I'm in compliance with all the rules and regulations and basically that sort of thing. So internal controls need to be in place. What an internal control cannot do, and this is extremely important when you're writing your policies, it cannot change an inherently poor manager into a good one. If you got managers out there who don't follow the rules, then most likely once you write a policy or a procedure, they probably won't either. So it's not going to turn them into a good manager. They need to be part of the planning process in writing those policies. Internal controls cannot ensure success or even survival. In other words, what it means is no matter how good you are with your internal controls, that doesn't mean your company is definitely going to be profitable, but at least you know that you're trying to prevent any problems. It cannot ensure the reliability of financial reporting and compliance with laws and regulations. It can only show reasonable, not absolute assurance that you did everything you could to try to do things right, okay? If there is a loophole in your process, okay, someone will find it. And you'll notice that in that little design that we have up in the corner, what causes fraud is an opportunity that's been created. Someone has an inside motivation for committing fraud, and therefore they can rationalize why they should go ahead and commit it. If you have a loophole in your policies and processes, and that's why you flowchart out step by step, if you have a loophole and don't close it, then that's where your fraud can happen, okay? The limitations of internal controls, the reality is that judgments and decisions making can be faulty. Breakdowns can occur from simple error or mistake. Controls can be circumvented by the collusion of two or more people if they figure out your loophole. Management, if they have the ability to override the system, that can also create a loophole if you're not careful. So watch for that. It's not wrong for management to be able to override the system. Just be careful how it's done. And of course, the design of the control system must reflect the fact that there are resource constraints. And most of your electronic AP systems try to prevent all this. But once again, if someone tries to go around the system, then that creates it. Let me give you one case example, okay? This is a true story, by the way, all right? Read what it says here in this case example. The treasurer for the city in a small town was very well known, highly respected in this little town. On payday, he would go to the employees and announce he was on his way to the bank to cash his paycheck. Would any of the employees like for him to cash theirs also? He would put the employee's endorsed paycheck in an envelope with the employee's name on it, go to the bank, and the bank tellers would cash the checks. That right there shouldn't have happened, but hey, we're talking about a small town, remember? He would put the cash in the appropriately marked envelope and deliver the money back to the employee. Everything sounds fine, right? But at some point, the treasurer realized he could make some money from this venture. When an employee would terminate their employment, he would hold them on the books for several weeks. See, he had too much, I guess you might say, power in what was going on. So he would continue to process paychecks for them, endorse the paychecks, and carry them to the bank for cashing. He would then pocket the money. The reason he was caught was because at the end of year one of the terminated employees, one of them decided that they were going to question the amounts on their W-2. And so he got caught. But look at what we're talking about. He was a trusted, well-known, respected person. And the idea is there was a loophole. There was not something in place to track when someone terminated. Well, when you're dealing with accounts payable, the same person who is ordering should not be receiving, should not be paying. Keep all of that in mind. Flow chart it out, okay? All right, so when you're writing the format for your policy and procedures manual, all right, here's an example. Once you've established what procedures are going to work best for your organization, tying it to your electronic accounts payable system, then you need to write a format that employees will understand what they're supposed to do. Outlines are the simplest and easiest to read and understand, but they may not tailor very well to someone who's visual. So flowcharts also allows people to see how their responsibilities work. This is just one example implementation matrix that was used in an Excel spreadsheet to help put together what someone is writing. Here's another example. We state what the policy is. There are the examples off to the right here. State what the policy is and why the policy exists. Then who does what. In the example that you see off to the right, this is actually taken directly from a software that already has all this written. All you have to do is go in and tweak it to make it work for your company. It's called Polyproc, P-O-L-Y, P-R-O-C. It already has all of this done. All you have to do is go in and basically fill in the blanks and make it adjust to your software. And so even with electronic systems, this would be a step-by-step that I could show to a sales and use tax auditor. They would know I'm doing things right. It tells each employee what they're supposed to be doing step by step in order to make sure that we process the checks correctly and that sort of thing. And this is just one example. So the format of writing the policy and procedure is extremely important, okay? You must take caution to IRS, however. They require us to have what they call an accountable plan, all right? And basically, in order to be compliant with them, this accountable plan, one of the first rules is it must be in writing. If you are going to reimburse your employees for their expenses and you do not have a written policy for doing that, then you do not have an accountable plan. Everything, even with receipts, everything you reimburse your employees must be taxed. We want to make sure that we don't have a taxable event when it comes to our IRS accountable plan. Okay, so the three requirements for an accountable plan, besides the fact it must be in writing, is number one, if you're going to reimburse someone, there must be a business connection and the expense tied to it must be reasonable for that connection. Number two, there has to be a reasonable accounting for the expenses. In other words, things like receipts, if you're doing mileage and that sort of thing, then make sure you can show the reasonableness there. And then any excess reimbursements that basically you give to someone, they must give the money back or be substantiated within a reasonable period of time. In addition to these three tests, the plan cannot exhibit a pattern of abuse. And there's some examples that are out there. Okay, now, so reasonable period of time, what are they talking about? The safe harbor for it is if you're going to do any kind of advances, never advance cash more than 30 days before it's going to be used, must be substantiated within 60 days of giving them the money, but all expense reimbursements must have receipts or be substantiated within 120 days of the date the expense was incurred. So make sure that you understand that IRS is going to be really looking for this accountable plan. Now, if it is not accountable, then it's non-accountable and it will become taxable. So if your plan is a reimbursement or expense allowance arrangement that does not meet one or more of the three rules listed under the accountable plans, then it becomes taxable. So we've got to have policies that tell people exactly how it works. So the examples you see here, excess reimbursements, the employee fails to return the excess amounts back to the employer, the reimbursement of a non-deductible expenses to the employer's business. It has nothing to do with the business, but we went ahead and reimbursed the employee anyway, which we probably should not have done. And employee does not provide you with their documentary evidence. All of these must be counted as wages and taxed accordingly, okay? All right, so if we have our policy written properly, we shouldn't have any problems with expense reimbursements, and we should be able to make it so that basically we can show to auditors that there's not fraud or anything else going on. Okay, so Ty, let's take a look at our second polling question to see how people are doing with this part.
Thank you, Pamela. And as Pamela mentioned, now we're going to move to our second polling question. So please submit your responses into the chat box. The IRS recommends for organizations to have a written policy for expense reimbursements, but it is not required in order to reimburse employees on a non-taxable basis. A, true, B, false, or C, maybe. We've got a mixed bag here between true and false.
Well, actually, Ty, it was a trick question. If you'll notice, yes, if you notice, it says IRS recommends for organizations to have a written policy. Oh yeah, they recommend it, but it is required if you're going to reimburse an employee on a non-taxable basis. So actually, it's false in the long run, because I said it was not required, and I think I kind of reiterated several times, you must have the written policy or you're going to create a taxable event. So
wow.
That was a trick question.
Good one.
Oh yeah, they recommend it. But it is required if you want to do it on a non-taxable basis. Okay, so the answer is false. Thank you. All
Thank
right.
you. Good curveball.
All right, step 3. One of the things we said is in the steps to making sure you have effective policy and procedures manuals is to communicate to personnel and vendors what their part is in the process, and that sort of thing, what your process is and what their part is. So first off, communications is the key. It's important to keep in mind that although these are accounts payable issues, you've got people outside the accounts payable department who are responsible for some of the tasks. And so the smaller your company is, this is even more true. And of course, you got to watch for the possibility of fraud and everything else. But one of the biggest problems we have is a lot of non-financial people do not understand why it is so important for them to be involved and do these policies correctly. And so they don't understand their responsibilities and that sort of thing. Remember our formula: consistency plus comprehension is what's going to get you compliance, okay? So in order to implement a new policy, you're going to have to train all affected personnel. They have to understand what the new policy is, why it's being implemented, and why it's so important, and then designate who's responsible for carrying out that policy, and of course explain exactly what actions must be taken to ensure the policy is taken out as carried out properly. So in training them, they have to really understand their part in the system. Well, the same thing goes with vendors. When you explain to your vendors your process, it's a good idea to have a form letter that you might send out, an email or something like that to new vendors telling them what the process is. And this should be another procedure in your manual under the master vendor file policy. You can tell them what your pay process is. We pay all checks on the 15th and the 30th, something like that. Let them know whether or not you take your discounts and so on and so forth. Are they going to allow physical checks or ACH or both? Do you have to do credit cards? And of course, your requirements for invoicing on their part. What do they have to send you in order for you to be able to pay them? Okay, what do you do about things like disputes? How are they going to be handled? What's going to prevent you from their payments? Like, for instance, I will not pay any independent contractor if they have not given me a W-9. I don't care what their status is, whether they're a sole proprietor partnership, LLC, LLP, or whatever. If I don't have a W-9, I will not pay them. period. That's all there is to it. And so things like that, you need to inform them so they understand it. And then, of course, double check with them about any kind of sales and use tax issues, because if your invoices say something wrong on them, you have to know the laws. But if they say something wrong on them, it may be that you're creating a use tax liability. So you need an example, like all invoices should be FOB destination for sales tax purposes, that sort of thing. So make sure vendors know how that works, okay? So if you don't understand sales and use tax, you need to make sure you attend a webinar on that, and make sure that your purchasers and your salespeople attend it too, because all sales and use tax nightmares start at point of sale, point of purchase, okay? Now, with today's remote businesses, effective communication is even more important. So you need to put some practices in place. Are we going to email? And if we do we write bullet points instead of a narrative? Narratives, for some reason, don't seem to get across very well, but bullet points do. Attach all the necessary documents for perusal and things like that. E-conferencing, use platforms that allow everyone to share the information. You've got Zoom out there, you've got whiteboard tools, you've got Miro, you have, there's all kinds of softwares that you can work together. And then, of course, involve all affected personnel within your company in writing your policies and procedures. They might know something about the procedure that you don't. That means you can't write the policy the way you thought you could, or the procedure. So involve them in helping you write your policies and procedures. It's not only the best way to get compliance, but it's also a best way to find out if there's things that you're asking them to do that don't work in what's going on with the company, okay? All right, so let's go to another one of our polls. This is actually our polling question number 3. So let's find out what this one's all about. Ty?
Thank you, Pamela. Please submit your responses into the chat box. One of the best practices to get managers, supervisors, and other personnel outside the AP department to follow the policy and procedures is to A, tell them what the policy is, B, have them help write the policy, C, give them a copy of the policy, or D, all of the above. And an overwhelming response to D.
Thank you, everyone. That was another trick question. D is correct, but the answer to this question is actually B, one of the best practices. And it is one of the best. All of them are good practices, but one of the best one is have them help you write the policy. So it was another trick question, but in all, you did good, because I probably would have said all of the above also. So I like throwing trick questions out there once in a while. Thank you, everyone. All right, let's go ahead and let's sum this up, shall we, in our final analysis. All right, first off, accounts payable function. Remember, protect the company's assets, protect the bottom line, and prevent fraud. So all of our policies should do exactly that. So what we need to do is outline specifically how all transactions are processed from beginning to end, flow chart it out, and then write the policy and show people the importance of it. Ensure all your internal controls are in place. Once again, the person ordering should not be the person receiving, should not be the person that is paying, that sort of thing, whether it's goods or services. And make sure you're in compliance with all your IRS and state laws when it comes to taxes, whether it's IRS taxes or whether it is the W-9 issue for independent contractors and what forms to send, or whether it is your sales and use tax and that sort of thing. All right. Then a written policy, make sure you've got one for expense reimbursements. Remember, if we don't have a written policy, we do not have an accountable plan, so therefore everything becomes taxable. Create your accountable plan. Include requirement to provide receipts. What needs to be on those receipts? Guidelines for any kind of advances or allowances. Make sure that you know what per diems and car allowances are out there that meet IRS regulations. Have rules for a reasonable period of time for reporting and reimbursing. One of the things that I had someone do, I had an owner of a company who would only turn in his expense reports once a year. Well, unfortunately, because of that 120-day rule, anything that we reimbursed that was more than 120 days, we had to tax him for, even though he had his receipts. Got to follow the reasonable time period, okay? And then process to control reimbursements to help prevent fraud, because that is one of the biggest areas where fraud happens, okay? As far as your expense reimbursement policy, a well-drafted expense reimbursement policy will manage expectations about what and which businesses are related to, which expenses are related to business and can be reimbursed, establish procedures that they have to follow in order to get reimbursed, okay? And give them examples of what you want on the receipts and things like that. Set reasonable cost controls on employee business expenses. Let them know how much they can spend and that sort of thing. And of course, ensure that business expenses are appropriate. Make sure that you have proper authorizations in place. Who do they have to give their expense reimbursement request to get it approved before we actually pay that, okay? Now, remember, one other thing, for remote employees, your policy, this particular policy, should also be part of or referenced in any kind of telecommuting or remote policy for employees. So make sure that's in there, okay? Here are some resources that will be helpful to you as far as finding answers to questions. IRS has their government website regarding basically W-9 issues and the W-8s, 1099s and 1042s and so on. Each state, you'll have to go to your own state to figure out sales and use tax. So an example was you might type into Google or something like that, sales and use tax for Missouri or sales and use tax for Michigan or something like that, and it will take you to what you need to know there. Also, what you want to do is make sure you get good training in both of these areas. There's webinars out there that are available to you that will help you answer that. I mentioned earlier that there is an accounts payable manual template that's available to you. It's actually very inexpensive. It's called polyproc.com, and they not only have the accounts payable, but they also have accounts receivable, payroll, and then the entire accounting department. So this is a really good template. I've used it for years. The gentleman who wrote it is one of the leading experts as far as accounts payable goes when it comes to policies and procedures. So even with your electronic type of software and everything else, this works very, very well with that, okay? All right, so I think at this point, Ty, we can go ahead and see if there's any questions that I can answer for people that might help them in some of these areas. So let's go ahead and open up the floor to some questions, okay?
Thank you, Pamela. I would now like to take your questions. If you have questions, please submit them into the chat box now. And our first question reads, where can safe harbor guidelines for reimbursement be found?
Okay, IRS has their publication 15, okay, and that's where they will show the safe harbor reimbursement. So go to irs.gov and look for Pub 15. It answers a lot of questions in that area, and plus IRS does have a fact sheet, the FAQ sheet, that will help you in that area too. So the best place would be IRS. Now keep in mind at the same time, and I have to mention this, double check with your state income tax also, because it's very possible that even though it may not be taxable under IRS rules, your state income tax might say that it is. That happens a lot, like in the state of California and so on. So watch out for that one.
Thank you, Pamela. And our next question reads, can you direct us where we could find what the new remote rules are from slide 15?
I've got to go back to slide 15. Just a moment. Most of the remote rules that have come out just recently, we did a webinar on it just a couple of days ago, but most of the remote rules are listed in IRS's website. What I did was I typed in, and I actually found several websites available to help on this. I just typed into Google remote rules for expense reimbursements and remote rules for employees and that sort of thing, and as far as taxation. And I got all kinds of different websites from CPA firms and everything else. It might be to your advantage to actually talk to your CPA or your tax consultant to ask them about some of that too, because basically they can give you some answers in that area. Okay.
Thank you, Pamela. And that was our last question. So I will turn the floor back to you for any closing remarks.
Thank you, Ty. All right, the main thing to remember is a lot of people, when they write a policy and procedures manual, they are so vague in what they write that people really don't understand their part in the system. And the more that you go electronically, you've got to watch out for authorizations and everything else. So if they don't understand their part and they don't understand what authorizations they have and everything else, it makes it very difficult for them to actually do things the way that you want it done. But it also allows for the possibility of loopholes that will create fraud and so on. I strongly recommend that you do, even with your electronic systems, flowchart out who does what and step by step in the process. And the reason why is because not only do you want to set up those authorizations, but you want to look for, do I have one person doing several things at once so they could commit fraud and so on. One of the worst cases of fraud that I found was when someone had the authority to do it all. Not only could she order, but she could also receive, and she also paid. So what she did was she set up a personal bank account, okay, for a phantom, what we called a phantom vendor. And she basically wrote invoices out of that phantom vendor, sent them to her company. And of course, she was the one that was not only supposedly ordering these items, but authorizing them. And then of course, she would be the one that would pay them. So she set up the vendor file also. And all this monies that she was paying was going directly to this special account that she had opened up at the bank. She actually, believe it or not, also got herself a federal ID number for this supposed company, believe it or not. So the problem that we have here is she got away with approximately $1.5 million before they caught her. And she had too much authority. So your policy and procedures not only will help you in that area, but it will also make everything more efficient and effective. You'll see where your duplicate processes are that cause people to do the same thing over and over again. We used to say in the olden days when everything was paper, what we wanted to do was be able to touch a piece of paper just once, and that was it. I worked with a company once that was very inefficient. Believe it or not, even with their electronic system, it took them 89 steps from beginning to end to process one invoice, 89 steps. And it was interesting because the same person was touching that quote unquote paper electronically multiple times. And it was ridiculous. By the time we eliminated all the steps that basically were duplicates, it got down to where each person would deal with each document electronically just once. We got it down to less than 20 steps. And we cut out, believe it or not, we actually cut out the need for one of their personnel, which was kind of bad. So what we did was we made that person, we trained them and made them in charge of all the sales and use tax. And so basically we repurposed them in another way. So basically what you want to do is make sure you double check all of that, okay? In the meantime, good luck to you. Once again, don't forget about the polyproc. Use it to help you out. And if you have additional questions, you can always send them to us. We'll answer them later. I want to thank you for your participation. And Ty, I'll turn it back over to you at this point.
Thanks again, Pamela. On behalf of CFO Daily News, I would also like to thank everyone for attending the webinar. This concludes our program.